As I mentioned in the previous session, reconstruction should not be confused with what we are about to discuss next, which is the modification of an existing source of emissions. A modification is a physical or operational change that will result in an increase in emissions or new air contaminants being emitted that were not previously emitted. For example, proposing to add more spray guns to an existing coating operation is a physical change that would result in the use of more paint and therefore an increase in emissions. Changes in the method of operation, like increasing the input rate of raw materials, will result in more material being used and as a result increase emissions. Also, other changes like changing a fuel type or switching raw materials may result in altering the nature of the emissions. Okay, if you're modifying an existing process, it's sometimes difficult to determine when a permit is required and when one is not required. We've developed a flowchart to guide you through the steps. You can download a copy of this flowchart by clicking on the link shown here. Now, I do realize the flowchart is rather large, so as I go through it, if you don't understand a term or concept or have further questions, you can feel free to call us at any time at the Environmental Assistance Center. Let's start at the top corner of this flowchart. The very first question you're going to ask yourself about the change you're making is if the physical or operational change will increase the potential emissions of an air contaminant. If it doesn't, then it's not a modification. However, you're going to have to check to see if the emission unit or process is covered under an existing permit to install. And if it is, you have to determine if the change will require changes to any conditions of the permit. If permit condition changes are required, you're going to need to complete a permit application requesting the appropriate changes be made to the permit conditions. If there are no conflicts with the existing permit conditions, the proposed change does not meet the definition of a modification, and no action is going to be required. If the proposed change will increase emissions, then let's move down to the next box. And basically here what you're going to do is look to see if the change in emissions or an increase in emissions is considered significant according to Rule 278. And we talked about what 278 says earlier. If the emissions are considered significant, it is considered a modification and you will have to apply for a permit to install. If the change in emissions is not significant, well then you take a look at the emission unit or the process to see if it's considered exempt. And if the emission unit is exempt under one of the installation construction permit exemptions which you talked about earlier, and if it's still exempt after the proposed change, then the modification does not need a permit to install. If a permit to install does exist for the emission unit or the process that we're talking about, you're going to have to review the special conditions of the permit to find out if there is an emission limit for the air contaminant that's being increased. If there is an emission limit for the air contaminant being increased, and if the proposed increase in emissions requires a change to the existing permit limit, then the proposed change is a modification that's going to require a new permit to install. If the emissions increase is allowed by the existing emission limit, but does require changes to some other condition in the permit, again you're going to need to apply for a permit to install. If the increase does not require changes to the existing emission limits or any other permit conditions, then the proposed change is not a modification and no action is required. If there is no emission limit for the air contaminant being increased, then we move down to our next set of boxes here, which really rounds out the rest of our flow chart. Now these boxes here contain the modification exemptions for the Michigan Air Pollution Control Rules, Rules 285B and C. And if the modification involves changes to a supply or supplier of the same type of virgin fuel or changes to the material storage piles, the modification is going to be exempt. If the modification does not fit any of those exemptions, determine if the modification results in a meaningful change in the quality or nature or meaningful increase in the quantity of an air contaminant. If not meaningful, the modification is exempt. If it is a meaningful change in the nature or a meaningful increase in the quantity of an air contaminant, then it is a modification that requires a permit to install. Now, determining what a meaningful change is can get a little tricky. So if you plan to modify an existing emission unit or process, a source of emissions, I recommend you review the discussion of meaningful change and how to determine whether a change is meaningful. That's contained in the Determining Applicability Guidebook, which can be accessed by clicking on the link shown on your screen. The guidebook contains a lot of good examples and sample calculations, so I recommend you check it out. And remember, if you have questions about any of the things we discussed in this session, particularly how to determine if a change is meaningful or how to complete any of the steps, feel free to give us a call, the Environmental Assistance Program, and we'd be happy to help you out with any of your questions. You can also contact your Air Quality Division District Inspector. This concludes our session on modifications. Thank you.